13,000 feet below the surface, the ocean crushes steel like tinfoil. When the submarines descended to the wreckage, they expected to find nothing but twisted metal on sea deck. But the cameras caught something that defied every law of destruction. A door. The entrance to cabin C-55. Behind that rotting wood wasn't just salt water. It was the tomb of one of the darkest decisions made on the night of April 14, 1912. Today, we're going to unlock C-55. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, if you were facing an impossible choice in the middle of the Atlantic, what would you do? Stay until the end, because what they found down there changes everything. In the documentaries you've seen 100 times, the cameras almost always return to the same familiar scenes, the sweeping recreations of the grand staircase, the massive crystal chandeliers swaying, the first-class dining rooms gleaming with silver cutlery, and, inevitably, that slow, fatal scrape along the wall of North Atlantic ice. But the real story of this shipwreck doesn't live in the visible destruction or in the mass panic that swept the open decks. The deeper narrative, the one that still echoes today, is hidden in places few people dare to look closely. In the microscopic details and the shadows of the cabins that were sealed shut by the tragedy itself. Cabin C-55, located in one of the most coveted sections of the ship, was no ordinary stateroom. It was a full parlor suite, a sanctuary of privilege, engineered down to the last inch to house the most powerful figures of the age. That space represented the absolute pinnacle of human comfort at sea. Whoever had the resources to occupy it carried a fortune large enough to buy preference, priority, and a guaranteed seat in any lifeboat launched that night. Wealth, after all, tends to write its own rules, especially when survival is on the line. But there was one critical detail that escaped the logic of desperation. The distinguished occupant of Suite C-55 never set foot in one of those small rescue boats. While hundreds of people pressed against the upper decks, fighting for a safe spot under a frozen sky, a near-sepulchral calm had settled over that first-class corridor. Instead of leveraging his financial weight to escape, a solemn choice was made. A silent decision that defied the most primitive human instinct and transformed that lavish suite into a sealed vault, built by the will of its occupants to hold the final moments of two lives bound by an unbreakable commitment. The exact sequence of those final minutes remained a mystery locked in the deep for countless decades. The crushing weight of the water promised to erase every trace of that story. Yet when modern expeditions finally cast their powerful beams across the ruins of SeaDeck, reality exceeded every assumption. What the robot cameras recorded down there reveals not only the terrifying resilience of organic materials, it tells, with ghostly precision, exactly why that door never opened. And the answers rising from that steel tomb will completely change the way you see that night. To unlock the mystery resting behind that pressure-sealed door, we first need to dive into the mind and history of the man who held its key. SeaDeck aboard that great ship was no mere hallway lined with rooms. It functioned as a floating boulevard of the world's highest aristocracy, a microcosm where wealth made the rules and the heaviest surnames of the era paraded their influence. To grasp the magnitude of what happened in those final hours, you need to understand the level of power concentrated on that single deck. This was where the true financial weight of society rested, wrapped in Egyptian linen sheets and surrounded by hand-carved mahogany panels. Suite C-55, which connected privately and exclusively to C-57, was the pinnacle of naval engineering for extreme luxury. We're not talking about a standard ship cabin. We're talking about a space specifically designed to make the richest men in the world forget completely that they were crossing the North Atlantic aboard a vessel. The walls of this suite were lined with rare, noble woods, polished to a mirror shine by craftsmen who dedicated months of their lives to ensure every detail breathed unquestionable opulence. Electric fireplaces, gleaming brass fixtures, wide beds that rocked gently with the hypnotic rhythm of the deep water. Have you ever stopped to think about the false sense of absolute security that a setting like that can create in the human mind? When you are surrounded by that much comfort, tragedy feels like something that only happens to other people, never to you. But who exactly occupied this space of absolute privilege? Honoring the memory and the stature of those who were there, we need not focus on proper names alone, but on the sheer magnitude of their journeys. The historical record shows us that the principal occupant of this cabin was one of the most respected and influential men of his generation. He was a true retail titan, the great patriarch and owner of one of the most iconic and colossal department stores in all of New York City. A man who built a commercial empire with his own hands, shaping the economy of an entire metropolis. He traveled with his wife, the family matriarch, a woman of unshakable composure with whom he shared not only his fortune, decades of emotional partnership and companionship that would become the stuff of legend. They represented the undisputed top of the social pyramid. The money they held in vaults and investments was more than enough to buy the loyalty of any crewman, priority on any list, and the safest, most comfortable seat in the best lifeboat the ship had to offer. If we could pull our gaze away from the luxurious walls of Sea Deck for just a moment and take in the ship from the outside, the image would be breathtaking. A majestic silhouette tearing through the freezing silence of the ocean, a true mountain of black steel charging over the swells, crowned by 4 towering funnels belching thick columns of smoke against a brilliantly clear, star-filled sky. It was a sight that stole the breath, a testament to human audacity, defying the vastness of nature. And high above, on the dark crow's nest, the night lookouts strained their eyes against the black horizon. They had no optical equipment, no binoculars that might have spotted the danger in time to change the course of human history. They depended entirely on their own eyes and on the human capacity to read the shadows of the frozen ocean.
Something's ahead. I see it. Close.
While the great technological marvel plowed forward, relentless and proud. Inside sweet C-55, the contrast was brutal. While a cutting wind whipped the upper decks, the aging power couple rested in the warmth and silence of their private sanctuary. Luxury has that incredible ability to insulate people from the raw reality surrounding them. On that fateful night of April 14, 1912, their incalculable wealth rested quietly in the travel trunks at the foot of their beds, in the form of jewelry, important documents, and an aura of untouchability. They were New York royalty, sailing aboard a palace that the most confident voices of the era had declared impossible to sink. And yet, the forces of nature are merciless and completely blind to the hierarchies, bank balances, and titles of nobility that mankind constructs. The ocean draws no distinction between a humble boiler room worker and the owner of a commercial empire. When the inevitable finally came, it wasn't through a deafening head-on collision that would have stopped the ship dead in cinematic fashion. Reality tends to be colder than that. It was something far more insidious, far more stealthy, and far more lethal. A glancing, near-submerged blow, long and deep enough to tear through the steel hull just below the waterline, compromising critical compartments and allowing the ocean to begin claiming its massive prize silently, but with deadly momentum. The faint shudder, which many described as feeling like the ship rolling over thousands of small glass marbles, was enough to wake the most attentive passengers. The ice-cold water had already begun flooding the lower decks, tracing an inexorable dark destiny for the steel giant. Gradually, the stillness of sea deck would give way to the unsettling sound of hurried footsteps in the corridors, the tense voices of stewards, and the distant echo of orders being issued on the upper decks, where officers at their command posts stared through the night windows trying to grasp the scale of the damage. At that exact moment, as the ship's fate was being sealed in the darkness of the Atlantic, the colossal fortune of that aging couple began to evaporate, losing every shred of practical value. Within minutes, money would mean absolutely nothing beyond dead weight at the bottom of the sea. But there was one detail that would make the story of this cabin unlike anything that had come before. As panic took hold outside and the rules of civilization began to unravel, Sweet C-55 was not about to become the scene of a desperate escape. Instead, it was about to transform into the epicenter of the darkest, most emblematic, and most profoundly human decision of the entire shipwreck. A choice was about to be made, and it completely changes what we thought we knew about the survival instinct. When the official evacuation order finally began echoing through the endless steel corridors, the quiet luxury of sea deck was rapidly swallowed by an atmosphere of contained desperation and confusion. High in the command structure of the ship, the first officer and his subordinates watched through the bridge windows. The scene before them was one of absolute darkness, an ocean as flat as glass, reflecting a terrifyingly star-filled night, while the floor beneath their feet took on a subtle but undeniable tilt toward the bow. The cold, unforgiving North Atlantic was flooding the lower compartments, exacting its price for that lateral scrape that had fatally wounded an engineering marvel considered invincible. And as the gravity of the situation filtered down through the decks, chaos took hold in the minds that had only recently rested on beds of linen and mahogany. Have you ever felt that cold chill that precedes an imminent catastrophe? That split second of clarity when the human mind grasps that the end is unavoidable? That was exactly the feeling that began spreading like a virus among the first-class passengers. Men and women who were accustomed to having the world at their feet now stumbled about, disoriented, clutching fur coats over their night clothes and clutching small portable strongboxes, as if gold and diamonds could buy the mercy of the ocean. The stewards, their faces pale and severe, stripped of any cinematic heroism or reassuring smiles, knocked door to door with white-knuckled fists, instructing passengers to put on their stiff canvas life jackets and head immediately to the open decks. But there was one detail that stood out starkly against that backdrop of widespread panic. Amid shivering businessmen and aristocrats demanding privileges that no longer existed, eyewitness accounts on record point to a behavioral anomaly that defies human nature itself. The veteran retail magnate, the primary occupant of the coveted Suite C-55, showed not the slightest sign of despair. Walking alongside his devoted wife, the matriarch with whom he had built an empire over decades, he was escorted to the lifeboat loading area. Given his advanced age and his position of extreme power in New York society, one of the officers overseeing the evacuation quietly offered him an exception. The rule was clear: women and children first. But, in that moment of desperation, the officer opened a silent loophole, allowing the elderly billionaire to take a safe seat in one of the small wooden vessels about to be lowered into the darkness of the sea. And it was at that moment that history changed course. With a composure that stunned even the most seasoned sailors, the veteran magnate looked at the crowd of younger men pressing in on the decks, fathers being forced to say goodbye to their wives, and made an irrevocable decision. He shook his head and declared firmly that he would not board any lifeboat while there were younger men still on the ship who needed that spot. It was an absolute code of honor, a categorical refusal to use his social weight to steal another person's life. Faced with this self-imposed death sentence, attention turned quickly to his wife. Officers, and even the man himself, urged her fervently to board, to save herself, and carry on the family's legacy on dry land. But the loyalty built over an entire lifetime proved far denser than the fear of the abyss. With the same unshakable resolve, she refused to leave him behind. Witnesses of that early morning reported that she looked into the eyes of the man with whom she had shared her life, and stated with cutting clarity, wherever he went, she would go too. The money, the titles, the material possessions accumulated across a lifetime, all of it was reduced to ash in that instant. The only thing that mattered now was the dignity of facing the inevitable together, without cowardice and without pleading. What very few people know, and what will become the centerpiece of our dive into the deep in just a moment, is that this exact moment sealed not only a tragic destiny, but created a striking physical and temporal anomaly that scientists would spend nearly a century trying to understand. The elderly couple, hand in hand, turned their backs on the lifeboats and began a long, silent walk back into the heart of the wounded giant. They descended the great staircase, moving away from the deafening noise of the upper decks, the muffled crying of children, and the groaning of the evacuation ropes, returning to the seclusion of sea deck. The exact moment they retreated inside the cabin, and the heavy wood and steel door was closed and locked from within, marks one of the most solemn moments in the history of human navigation. C-55 instantly ceased to be a mere luxury room, a symbol of status and wealth, and became, in that very instant, a sealed vault, created by the deliberate choice of its occupants to hold their final and most intimate moments. They chose not to watch the water rise. They chose not to hear the screams of those left behind, closing themselves into their own world to await the ocean's verdict. If we could take a brief breath now and cast our eyes to the exterior of the ship, we'd see the massive black bow already dangerously submerged in the freezing water, swallowing hundreds of tons per second. The enormous funnels contrasted against a blazing Milky Way above, as the tilt grew more severe, etching the silhouette of the tragedy against an empty horizon. The ship, a proud and stubborn engineering marvel, was losing its battle against physics. And deep within the hull, protected by heavy locks, a couple waited in absolute silence. The problem is that the crushing force the water would exert on that structure during the free fall to the ocean floor should have pulverized everything inside. It should have erased every physical trace of that promise of eternal love. But as we'll see, the ocean plays by its own inexplicable rules, and what it chose to preserve inside that sealed room will completely change what we know about destruction. The heavy wood and steel door of Suite C-55 was locked from the inside, permanently sealing its elderly occupants away from the frantic panic overtaking the open decks. From that solemn moment, our story abandons the star-lit surface of the North Atlantic and begins a long, terrifying descent into the darkest and most unforgiving laws of physics. To understand the true archaeological miracle that research teams would encounter on the ocean floor decades later, we must first grasp the formidable scale of violence that the ship endured during its final journey. When the naval engineering marvel finally lost its battle against the frozen ocean, the sinking was no quiet, melancholy disappearance beneath calm waters. It was, in every sense, a staggering choreography of mechanical destruction. As the massive bow was flooded by thousands of tons of seawater, pouring in through that long and lethal lateral gash, the monstrous weight began dragging the forward section toward the abyss with relentless force. That massive lever motion heaved the enormous aft half of the ship completely out of the sea, exposing its colossal bronze propellers to the cold night air. Simultaneously, the four monumental funnels, which had once symbolized the unshakable power of mankind, belching smoke with confidence, lost their structural support and plunged into the black water. The angle of tilt grew more acute and unnatural, creating an absolute nightmare scenario where gravity turned against the very rules of naval architecture. The colossal tension applied to the ship's geometric center became mathematically impossible to withstand. The sound of thick steel plates groaning and splitting under their own weight thundered across the empty horizon until it culminated in a seismic event. The ship simply could not bear the force of its own mass and broke violently in two. The bow section, enormously dense, hydrodynamic in its design for cutting through waves, broke free and immediately began a harrowing plunge, sinking like a massive torpedo aimed directly at the ocean floor. Within moments, the huge stern section, which had momentarily resurged to the surface with a thunderous crash, sending massive waves outward, began flooding rapidly through the exposed wounds of the central break, and was also swallowed by the darkness. From the moment both halves disappeared from sight, they began a free fall of exactly 12,500 feet to the bottom, a distance so lonely and bleak that not even the faintest rays of sunlight have ever reached that desolate territory. During that vertiginous descent toward the abyssal plains, the brutality of the water should have summarily annihilated every hollow compartment within the metal structure. And this is precisely where our story reaches its true peak of mystery. Oceanographic physics tells us with absolute certainty that at nearly 13,000 feet of depth, the hydrostatic pressure exerted by seawater equals a staggering 5,800 pounds per square inch. In practical, easy-to-visualize terms, that means having the weight equivalent to several heavy semi-trucks, crushing every single square inch of the ship simultaneously. It's an absurdly overwhelming environmental force, more than sufficient to reduce thick structural beams to twisted wire and to detonate any sealed container in a fraction of a millisecond. The inevitable, cruel logic of the deep dictated that the grand, wide cabins of SeaDeck should have violently and catastrophically imploded long before touching the fine silt of the ocean floor, grinding the expensive mahogany panels, the lavish furniture, and any trace of organic matter into an impenetrable mass of pulverized debris. The problem is that when deep-water exploration science finally managed to illuminate the battered innards of that century-old wreck, the mechanical logic of destruction was completely humiliated by reality. When the most advanced remotely operated vehicles were sent by archaeological teams to map the degree of devastation in the first-class quarters, an absolute silence fell over the control room at the surface. Experienced oceanographers, watching those bright screens, held their breath. The high-definition cameras on the robotic arms began to drift slowly through the dark corridors, fully expecting to document an area of total obliteration. A claustrophobic environment where floor and ceiling had collided, forming a paste of metal compressed by implosions. Yet, when they cast their floodlights into the absolute darkness, they revealed a structural anomaly that still leaves naval engineers utterly fascinated. The specific corridor area housing Suite C-55, along with several adjacent doorways, had remarkably not undergone the same level of crushing that had decimated the sectors surrounding it. Instead of displaying only strangled corridors and passageways blocked by fused steel, the lenses showed intact ceilings, aligned load-bearing walls, and a near-defiant resistance to the weight of the ocean. And the explanation for this true miracle of survival lies in an invisible yet formidable paradox. Because the aging magnates had made the final decision to remain in their private sanctuary during the evacuation cries, they had meticulously engaged the heavy interior locks on the suite. The solid, custom-fitted wood and the efficient metal latches of the door acted as an impressive partial barrier. As the giant drowned, and the external pressure on the outer hull became lethal, the freezing water was unable to burst into that room in a sudden, torrential rush. Instead, this seal, created by the courage not to flee, forced the ocean to infiltrate patiently through the minimal available gaps. As it seeped in slowly, the water compressed in a controlled, gradual manner all the air trapped inside the luxurious cabin, creating an extremely rare accidental engineering phenomenon that scientists define as pressure equalization pockets. And that changes everything we thought we knew about the devastation of that night. Once the interior of that vast stateroom was completely flooded by water before the external collapse could burst it from the outside in, the opposing forces found a perfect equilibrium. That suite was not crushed during the terror of the rapid descent. It sank heavily through the dark water and came to rest on the fine silt of the abyssal plain, preserving its essential geometric form. The solid wooden structures, now reinforced by the very water that had invaded them, held firm under the astronomical weight of 2.5 miles of ocean pressing down on their ornate ceilings. When the delicate mechanical arms of modern submarine expeditions positioned themselves inches from the obscured threshold of that untouched door, the researchers knew they were not about to explore a simple shipwreck. They were standing before a mausoleum armored by nature itself and by the improbable laws of deep-sea physics. But the surprise of finding the walls still standing would not, by any means, be the definitive shock for the outside world. The overwhelming impact that would silence every last doubter of time's persistence would arrive the moment those tiny robot cameras managed to breach the shadowed gap of the stateroom. What the lenses would record inside, resting in the eternal stillness of the deep, would prove once and for all that the ocean has a strange and sublime way of preserving the memory of those who chose not to run from it. The darkness at 13,000 feet below the surface is absolute and glacial, an impenetrable void that sunlight has never dared to touch. When scientific expeditions sent their ROVs to the muddy floor of the North Atlantic, their mission was to penetrate the secrets that the tragedy had locked away. The team of archaeologists, crowded into the control room of a surface vessel, guided their delicate titanium avatars through a somber cemetery. The primary target of that meticulous incursion was C-Deck, once the boulevard of the global elite. The general expectation was to find an absolute void, a compartment where the fury of the water had shredded every human trace, turning the veteran magnate's luxurious suite into a simple crushed steel box. But there was one detail that would stop the scientists cold. When the mechanical arms lit up the remaining gap of the sealed door, the images made no sense to anyone expecting total obliteration. A reverential silence settled over the control room. The camera drifted over the carpet of sediment and revealed that the space had not been swept by chaotic currents. Instead of geological erasure, the lenses captured the terrifying resilience of materials that simply refused to disappear. The noble wood of the walls had been slowly consumed by bacteria over the decades, leaving only ghostly contours of the original architecture. Yet, the absence of that wood exposed an arrangement of artifacts that defied the acidity of the salt water. Luxury brass objects, glowing softly with a greenish hue, emerged from the darkness. As the vehicle rotated its panoramic focus, the scale of the astonishment grew. The lenses revealed the impressive metal frames of the suite's wide beds, resting side by side in perfect symmetry. They had not been hurled against the walls. They remained anchored rigidly in their exact positions, and right at the foot of those frames, the heavy base supports of the grand travel trunks still sat on the floor. They seemed to be waiting, with a century's worth of patience, for a disembarkation that never came. These inert objects resembled fossils of an extinct civilization, proving that the courage to lock that door had preserved the physical memory of its interior. But the ocean held in its muddy floor an even more intimate detail. Salt water melts steel and consumes bone, but there is one human mark that is flatly rejected by the abyss. And this discovery would forever change the emotional weight of future dives. The most haunting detail that the camera lenses recorded in that unfathomable abyss was not found in the great structures of naval engineering. It was in what the ocean simply could not destroy. When we speak of a colossal shipwreck resting more than 13,000 feet down for over a century, there is a natural scientific assumption that the forces of nature have reclaimed absolutely everything. We know through continuous explorations that voracious metal-eating bacteria are consuming the heavy hull plates and the remnants of the 4 towering funnels that fell into the darkness. The cold, highly corrosive water slowly melts the wrought iron and inexorably consumes biological traces, dissolving the calcium in bones until nothing remains of the physical presence of those who perished from that lethal lateral blow. But there was one fascinating and profoundly melancholy chemical detail that would transform areas like the immediate vicinity of Suite C-55 into silent, untouchable memorials. The industrial leather tanning process, widely used by elite master cobblers in the early 20th century, involved baths of strong acids and heavy oils designed to waterproof the material against the harsh weather of major cities. That same aggressive chemistry ended up turning the leather into a toxic, unwelcome material for marine biology. It is not consumed by bacteria. It does not dissolve in the freezing currents, and it stubbornly refuses to disappear under the crushing weight of 5,800 pounds per square inch. As a direct result of this macabre immunity, explorers reported discoveries that chilled the blood of every researcher on the surface. Directing the powerful flood beams toward the ocean floor, they found no bodies, but instead the most personal and unmistakable human mark imaginable. Matched pairs of shoes rested gently on the thick silt, arranged with precise, almost deliberate alignment, side by side. They sat in the exact position and at the same distance in which the veteran magnate and his loyal wife had left them, before making their irrevocable decision to lock that heavy wooden door. The lenses captured robust boots and elegant women's shoes, preserving the walking creases and wear patterns that had once strode the sunlit, lavish corridors of first class. And that completely changes what we know about the emotional impact of these scientific expeditions. Watching the enormous, majestic bow on a screen generates historical fascination. But when the camera slowly zooms in on a pair of shoes resting in eternal darkness, the tragedy is humanized in a devastating way. That footwear is not simply a discarded piece of clothing. It's an unmistakable ghostly signature, proof that someone breathed, held power, and loved deeply before facing the end. The merciless ocean took their lives, but was extraordinarily unable to erase the physical outline of their final steps toward eternity, transforming those corridors into a true cemetery without bodies. The problem is that this unusual preservation creates an extremely thorny moral crossroads. When oceanographers come face to face with shoes that mark the exact spot of eternal rest of passengers who chose not to abandon ship, the dividing line between archaeological research and the desecration of a grave becomes dangerously thin. And it is precisely that turbulent ethical debate about what should or should not be recovered that leads us to the final frontier of our journey into the deep. The area of cabin C-55 raises the greatest and most painful ethical question in all of deep-water expedition history. Attempting to force entry into those meticulously sealed cabins to recover jewelry, gold pocket watches, or fragile, crumbling documents, is that an act of legitimate archaeology, or is it a direct violation of a grave? The company holding the legal salvage rights spent many decades justifying its intrusion into these preserved areas of the ship as a noble mission to safeguard human history, claiming the valuable artifacts will be lost forever if not brought to the surface quickly. But there is one detail that those corporate justifications simply cannot silence. For the descendants of the passengers and for the most passionate defenders of maritime memory, unlocking doors that were locked from the inside and removing those personal belongings is the precise equivalent of desecrating a sacred shrine. Those dark corridors shelter the final choice of people who accepted their fate with enormous dignity, refusing privileges and lifeboat seats. Disturbing that eternal rest in the name of museum exhibitions or auction houses crosses a very dangerous and disrespectful moral line. The vast ocean swallowed the owner of cabin C-55, but it was powerless to erase the fact that, in the middle of the panic and brutal destruction of that early morning, some heavy wooden doors were closed by an unshakable, deliberate choice. The sealed suite, resting at 13,000 feet below the surface, doesn't hide merely luxury artifacts corroded by time. It holds physical, irrefutable proof that true courage, more often than not, means the nobility of choosing to stay behind. In light of everything we've explored today, I ask you, do you agree with the modern expeditions that remove these intimate items from the ocean floor to display them in museums? Or do you believe that places like the cabin of the magnate and his wife should be considered untouchable sanctuaries? Leave your honest opinion in the comments below. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you on our next documentary.